Story 1. The Missing Hikers. I've lived in East Tennessee for most of my life. Growing up, I often heard old wives' tales and urban legends about strange creatures lurking in the forests. Like most kids, I assumed they were just stories meant to scare children away from dangerous places, to keep them from falling into ravines or getting lost in the vast wilderness. As I got older, I found myself drawn to these strange tales. That curiosity led me to investigate such things in my spare time. While most folks around here obsess over Bigfoot, treating him like some local celebrity, they tend to ignore or downplay other cryptids. With hundreds of thousands of acres of unexplored forest, I always figured there was plenty of space for something to remain hidden. Unlike most, I was more interested in the legends of the Dogman. When I graduated high school, my only goal was to become a park ranger. What better job than being surrounded by nature every day, even with all its dangers? It was a life I truly loved. There are dozens of stories I could tell, but one that has never left my mind is the case of the missing hikers from a few years ago. It was early October. The Smoky Mountains were ablaze with color, nature's own fireworks display, reminding me why I had chosen this career. I was on patrol when a call came in about a missing group near Fontana Lake. A woman reported that her husband, son, and brother-in-law had gone fishing and never returned. I took their description, got details about their truck and boat, then headed out to search for them. She mentioned they had planned to fish near Wolf Creek. I called it in and decided to drive down to Flat Branch, hoping they might have gone into the river there. It was a long drive, though out in the backwoods of the Smokies, every drive is a long one. When I arrived, I found 3 trucks parked off to the side. 2 had empty boat trailers. Checking the details she had given me, one matched the missing party's vehicle. That gave me a starting point. I walked to the water, scanning for any signs of them. Nothing. A house sat nearby, so I asked the owner if he had seen a boat matching their description. He recalled spotting a similar vessel the day before, with 2 men and a boy aboard heading west. When I asked if he had a boat and could take me up to Wolf Creek, his demeanor changed. The friendly, talkative man went silent, his face darkening. "I'll take you across the river," he muttered, "but not all the way to Wolf Creek." I took what I could get. After a quick jog back to my truck to grab my backpack, he ferried me across and left just as quickly. From there, it was a mile or so to the rural campsite I suspected they had used. I started along the riverbank, scanning for any sign of them. Before long, I spotted a boat on the shore. As I got closer, I confirmed it was theirs. So far, everything pointed to a simple case of someone staying out later than planned. Maybe their engine had trouble, or they had hiked further than expected. It all seemed too easy. I made my way toward their campsite, hoping to find them gathered around a fire, packing up to head home. But when I arrived, things took a dark turn. The campsite was in shambles. 2 tents had been set up, both slashed open. Inside, sleeping bags and equipment lay strewn about as if something or someone had torn through them. I tread carefully, not wanting to disturb any evidence. Then, in the second tent, I found something even more unsettling: drops of blood. Near one of the sleeping bags, a notebook lay open. I picked it up and began to read. On October 3rd, we headed out for our annual fishing trip this morning. Mom wasn't too happy. but we told her we'd be back tomorrow. The drive to the boat launch was long, but we passed the time talking about all the fish we were going to catch. Dad tried to scare me with stories about a cryptid that supposedly lives in the area, but I knew he was just messing with me. We reached the lake and launched without trouble, except Uncle Roger nearly fell in while untying the boat. Dad and I got a good laugh out of it. Once we were out on the water, he settled in. A few beers later, even he was laughing at himself. We caught a few fish, but they were too small, so we had to throw them back. Dad said he knew a better spot further up Wolf Creek. At the new spot, Uncle Roger caught 3 largemouth bass, and I caught 2. Dad had a big one, but it slipped off the line before we could net it. As the sun set, Dad suggested we head to one of the rural campsites. We pulled up to shore, tied the boat to a tree, and hiked to camp. The site was empty, which Dad said was odd, since it's usually crowded. We set up our tents, built a fire, and Uncle Roger cleaned the fish. We ate, told stories, and laughed until dark. Dad said there was an even better fishing spot further west, and he wanted to go there early in the morning before heading back. It's the middle of the night now, and Dad is playing a joke on me. I woke up and he wasn't in the tent. I can hear rustling outside, along with something pawing the ground and snorting. I know it's him, trying to scare me. He and Uncle Roger told cryptid stories at dinner, probably hoping I'd get spooked. I refuse to fall for it. I know if I go out there, he'll just run and hide. Pretending to be some monster, I roll over and try to sleep, ignoring the noises outside. I turned the page, my pulse quickening. The next entry was hurriedly written, the handwriting shaky. October 4th. Uncle Roger never woke me. Dad never came back. I wanted to call for help, but Dad had the only phone. As we tried to figure out what to do, we heard rustling in the woods. The birds went silent. Then we saw it. It was huge, standing on its hind legs. Its body made these awful cracking sounds as it moved, like its bones that were snapping in and out of place. It was covered in thick fur, but its claws and teeth glistened in the moonlight. It saw us. Uncle Roger grabbed me, yanking me behind his tent. We tried to stay still, but the thing let out a deafening roar. It sniffed the air, then stepped toward our tent, as if searching for something. Uncle Roger whispered, "Come on." We slipped away down the bank of the creek, walking in the water to hide our scent. He said there was a bridge downstream where we could hide. If we were quiet enough, maybe it would lose us. I lowered the notebook, my hands tense. Something terrible had happened here, and if I was reading this correctly, there was something still out there. I needed to find them. Story 2. Into the darkness. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. The notebook in my hands felt heavier than it should have, as if the inked words carried the weight of something sinister. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. If the boy and his uncle had run, where were they now? And more importantly, was that thing still out there? I scanned the ruined campsite once more, searching for any further signs. The bloodstains near the tent weren't large, but they were fresh. I followed the disturbed ground leading away from the site, toward the creek the boy had written about. The damp earth made it easier to track their steps. As I neared the water's edge, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves above. The sun had begun its descent, casting elongated shadows through the dense foliage. A deep unease settled over me. Then I saw them. Tracks, not just from the boy and his uncle. Something else had been here too. Massive, clawed impressions were imprinted in the soft mud alongside their hurried footprints. My heart pounded as I studied them, tracing their erratic path. The creature had followed them right to the water. I knelt by the creek, trying to make sense of the scene. The human tracks vanished into the water, just as the boy had written. They must have walked through it to mask their scent. But the other tracks, the beast had prowled along the bank, circling, searching. The air felt thick with something unspoken, an unseen force pressing against me. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I forced myself to move forward. I wasn't just here as a curious investigator. I was a ranger, and I had a job to do. The bridge. That was the next clue. If they had hidden there, I needed to check it out. Keeping my hand near my firearm, I followed the river downstream. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds of birds and insects had faded, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the steady rush of water. Finally, the bridge came into view. A simple wooden structure, weathered with age, spanning the narrow creek. I approached cautiously, stepping lightly on the damp earth. Something didn't feel right. The boards were scuffed, as if something heavy had walked across them recently. My gut told me to turn back, but my duty pushed me forward. I ducked beneath the bridge, shining my flashlight into the darkness. There, scratches in the wood, deep, deliberate gouges, as if something had clung to the underside, waiting. My throat went dry as I ran my fingers over the marks. Whatever had made these hadn't just been lurking. It had been hunting. I scanned the area, searching for any sign of the boy or his uncle. If they had hidden here, they might have left something behind. That's when I saw it. A small, tattered piece of fabric caught on a splintered plank. Dark stains smeared across the wood near it. Blood. My pulse quickened. They had been here, but had they escaped? The water rippled beneath the bridge. My breath hitched. Was something still down there? I turned off my flashlight and crouched, listening. The forest was silent, almost too silent. My skin prickled with the undeniable sensation of being watched. Slowly, I backed away, keeping my eyes on the water. A branch snapped behind me. I spun, my hand instinctively reaching for my gun. But there was nothing. Just trees, stretching endlessly into the dusk. I exhaled shakily, forcing myself to move. I needed to get back to the campsite. To reassess, I had to find them before it was too late. As I turned to leave, the wind carried something through the trees, a low, guttural growl, and it was close. Story 3. The hunt begins. The growl sent a cold shiver down my spine. It was deep, guttural, an unnatural sound that didn't belong in the quiet woods. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my training as a ranger kept me rooted. I turned slowly, my flashlight casting long, trembling beams into the thickening darkness. The trees swayed gently, their branches creaking, but there was nothing there. At least, nothing I could see. I inhaled deeply, steadying my nerves. Every part of me was alert now. The unease I had felt earlier had solidified into certainty. Something was out here, watching me. The boy's journal entries had warned of a beast, something large and unnatural. And now, I was beginning to believe them. My eyes darted to the ground, scanning for fresh tracks. The muddy earth told a chilling story. Deep, clawed imprints leading away from the creek, moving parallel to the path I had taken. It had been following me. I tightened my grip on my flashlight and unholstered my sidearm. The weight of it in my palm was reassuring, but did little to ease the fear creeping up my spine. I needed to move. Standing still in the open was a mistake. I turned toward the direction of the ruined campsite, planning to retrace my steps and head back toward my truck. Then, another sound. A snapping branch, much closer this time. I whipped around, heart hammering. The darkness felt alive, pressing in around me. My flashlight flickered, then steadied, illuminating the gnarled trunks of ancient trees. A thick mist had begun to creep in from the river, curling around my boots like grasping fingers. Then I saw it. 2 glowing eyes, hovering just above the underbrush. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, and they weren't just watching me. They were locked onto me, unblinking, assessing. A deep, rumbling breath filled the silence. The air felt heavy, charged with something primal and deadly. I had seen enough. I took a slow, careful step backward. My muscles coiled, ready to move. The creature stayed where it was, watching. My mind raced. If I ran, it would chase. If I stood my ground, it might attack. I had to think. The notebook. The boy had written about how they escaped through the creek, masking their scent. My boots were already damp from the riverbank. If I could reach the water, maybe. A sudden snarl shattered the silence. It was moving. The underbrush exploded as the creature lunged forward, its massive form barely visible through the mist. I turned and ran, not toward the path, but toward the creek. My feet pounded against the muddy ground, my breath ragged in my ears. The sound of snapping branches and thudding footsteps closed in behind me. I dove into the water. The icy current swallowed me whole, shocking my body as I fought to keep my grip on my flashlight. I surfaced, gasping, and twisted in the water just in time to see the creature skid into a halt at the riverbank. It loomed in the dim light, its silhouette monstrous. The mist parted just enough for me to see its form. A hulking beast, covered in matted fur, standing on 2 legs, its elongated snout twitching as it sniffed the air. It hated the water. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and let the current carry me downstream, my limbs burning from the cold. My boots dragged against submerged rocks, slowing me. But I forced myself to keep moving. My only chance was to get as far away as possible before it decided to follow. Minutes felt like hours as I drifted. The forest blurred past, shadowy and endless. Finally, the river widened, and I spotted an embankment with enough of a slope to crawl onto. I dragged myself ashore, my breath coming in heaving gasps. My whole body trembled, but I was alive. For now, I forced myself to stand, scanning the woods. I had no idea how far I had traveled, but I had to keep moving. My radio was still strapped to my belt. I fumbled for it, my fingers stiff from the cold, and pressed the button. Ranger station, this is static. My stomach sank. No signal. I clenched my jaw. I couldn't afford to sit here waiting for help that wouldn't come. I needed higher ground. If I could get back to the main trails, I could find a way to call this in. I started moving again, deeper into the forest. The hunt had begun. Story 4. The final stand. The forest felt different now. Every rustling leaf, every shifting shadow sent a spike of adrenaline through my veins. I had evaded the beast, for now, but I knew it was still out there, stalking, waiting. I pressed forward, my boots squelching in the damp earth. My radio was useless, and my only weapon was my sidearm, which suddenly felt far too small for what I was up against. My priority was finding a vantage point, a place where I could regroup and come up with a plan. Then, through the trees, I saw it. A fire, faint and flickering, nestled deep within the woods. My breath caught. Someone else was out here. I moved cautiously, weaving between the trunks, careful not to make too much noise. As I drew closer, the shape of a small cabin came into view. It was old, weathered, the kind of place hunters or hikers might use for shelter. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the warm glow of the fire inside cast long, dancing shadows through the broken windows. I hesitated. If someone was inside, they needed to know what was out here. But if this place was abandoned, then who had started the fire? I approached slowly, my gun raised. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I reached the door. I knocked once. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Hello? Still nothing. I exhaled sharply and pressed my hand to the doorknob. It turned easily, swinging open with a low groan. The warmth from the fire hit me first, a stark contrast to the cold night air. Inside, the cabin was sparse. Just a table, a few chairs, and a cot pushed against the far wall. A pot of something simmered over the fireplace, filling the air with a scent that made my stomach growl despite my fear. But there was no sign of anyone. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning every corner. A rifle rested against the wall, its barrel clean, well maintained. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry, or they were still close by. Then I saw the blood, a single drop, dark and fresh, staining the wooden floor near the cot. My stomach twisted. Something had happened here. A sound outside, a low, deliberate crunch of leaves. I froze. It was here. The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen tension. Slowly, I backed toward the fireplace, my fingers tightening around my gun. I didn't dare look out the window. I already knew what I would see. The doorknob rattled. I raised my weapon just as the door burst open. The creature lunged, its hulking frame barely squeezing through the doorway. Its eyes locked onto mine, burning with something far worse than hunger. Hatred. I fired, the gunshot deafening in the small space. The bullet struck its shoulder, but it barely flinched. It roared, slashing at the air between us, and I stumbled back, my heel catching on the edge of the rug. I hit the ground hard. The beast advanced, its claws ripping through the wooden floor as it closed the distance. I scrambled backward, my free hand knocking over the pot in the fireplace. Scalding liquid splashed across the creature's leg, and it howled in pain, recoiling just enough for me to roll onto my feet. I fired again. Once, twice. The shots tore into its chest, dark blood splattering against the walls. It staggered, its breaths ragged, but it wasn't finished. Neither was I. I grabbed the rifle from the wall, my hand steady despite the tremor in my chest. The creature snarled, lunging once more. I didn't hesitate. I pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the trees. The beast jerked mid-stride, its momentum carrying it forward until it crashed onto the floor, mere inches from my feet. Its breathing was shallow now, the rise and fall of its chest slowing. Then, finally, stillness. I exhaled shakily, my body trembling from exhaustion. The stench of blood and burnt fur filled the cabin. I took a step back, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. Then I heard it, a second growl, fainter, distant, but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. This wasn't over. Story 5. Echoes of the past. The cabin was silent now, except for the rhythmic crackling of the dying fire. My chest rose and fell in ragged breaths as I kept my gun trained on the lifeless body of the creature. Its massive frame lay sprawled across the floor, dark blood seeping into the wooden planks. My mind screamed at me to move, to get out of here before another one came. But something held me in place. A feeling, a whisper in the back of my mind. This wasn't over. I scanned the room, the flickering firelight casting jagged shadows across the walls. Then I saw it, a small, leather-bound book sitting on the edge of the old wooden table. It hadn't been there before, had it? I stepped closer, my hands still shaking from the fight. The book's cover was cracked with age, and when I touched it, a thin layer of dust lifted into the air. I opened it. The first few pages were written in hurried, messy handwriting. October 17th, 1953. I can hear them outside, scratching, sniffing. I thought moving here would keep me safe, but I was wrong. God help me. I was so wrong. October 19th, 1953. It wasn't always like this. They weren't always monsters. This started decades ago, long before I was born. A curse, a punishment. The forest keeps them hidden, but they are watching, always watching. October 22nd, 1953. If anyone finds this, you need to understand. They are not hunting us out of hunger. They are trying to silence us, to keep the truth buried. I swallowed hard. The words felt heavy, like the ink itself carried a weight of desperation. I flipped through more pages, past entries that spoke of missing people, failed attempts to fight back, and a sketch. My breath caught. The drawing was rough but unmistakable. It was them, the creatures. But there was something else. Underneath the sketch was a name, Nathaniel Grant. I knew that name. My grandfather had mentioned him once, long ago. He was a ranger, one of the first in this area. But he had disappeared without a trace. No one ever found his body. A chill ran down my spine as realization set in. This wasn't just a creature. This thing, this curse, was tied to something deeper. And if my grandfather had known about it, had he become one of them? A sudden gust of wind blew through the cabin, extinguishing the fire. The room plunged into darkness. My pulse pounded in my ears as I reached for my flashlight. But before I could turn it on, I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from beneath me. Slowly, I aimed my flashlight at the floor. The blood from the creature had pooled into the cracks between the wooden planks, seeping downward. My heart thudded as I crouched and ran my fingers along the edge of the floorboards. There was a seam, a trapdoor. I hesitated for only a moment before prying it open. A cold, damp air rushed up to meet me, carrying the scent of earth and decay. A narrow staircase led downward, swallowed in darkness. I gritted my teeth, gripping my gun tightly as I began my descent. The deeper I went, the colder it became. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls lined with bones, human bones, stacked neatly as if placed there intentionally. Then, at the end of the tunnel, I saw it. A massive stone altar, covered in symbols I didn't recognize. And beyond that, a figure, tall, unmoving, watching me with glowing, inhuman eyes. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a hunt. This was a ritual, and I had just walked straight into it. Story 6. The Forgotten Ones. The air in the underground chamber was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. My flashlight flickered as I stepped closer to the massive stone altar, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure before me remained motionless, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. I raised my gun. "Who are you?" My voice barely echoed in the hollow space. The figure stepped forward, revealing itself in the dim light. The thing that should have been human once, should have had a name, a past, a family, was now something else entirely. Its skin was stretched taut over its bones, patches of fur covering its elongated limbs, and its eyes, they weren't just glowing, they were filled with something ancient, something aware. "You don't belong here," it rasped, its voice a guttural mix of human and something far worse. Neither did it. I took a slow step backward, scanning the chamber. The walls were lined with crude carvings, depictions of creatures like the one before me. Some were hunting, others standing in a circle around a fire, their twisted forms silhouetted against the flames. At the bottom of the altar, I spotted something half buried in the dirt, a rusted badge. Nathaniel Grant. My breath hitched. The ranger from the old journal. My grandfather had spoken his name once. This wasn't just about the creatures. This was about the people they had taken, the forgotten ones. A deep growl rumbled behind me. I turned sharply, my flashlight sweeping across the room. More figures were emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing like embers in the dark. Some were taller, more monstrous. Others, still clinging to remnants of their former selves, their tattered clothes hanging from withered frames. I was surrounded, and they weren't just watching anymore. The first one lunged. I fired. The bullet struck its chest, but instead of going down, it screamed, a sound that rattled the very foundation of the chamber. The others shrieked in response, their cries a chorus of rage and torment. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get out. I bolted toward the passageway, my boots kicking up dust as I sprinted through the darkness. Hands clawed at my back, fingers like talons, grazing my skin. As I narrowly dodged their reach, my flashlight swung wildly, casting frantic shadows against the walls. Then, up ahead, I saw it. A staircase. I pushed harder, lungs burning as I threw myself forward. The moment I reached the steps, something grabbed my ankle. I crashed onto the stone, pain jolting through my knee as I twisted to see what had me. One of them, a woman or what had once been one. Her face was gaunt, her lips moving soundlessly as if trying to remember how to speak. But her grip was inhumanly strong. I kicked out with my free leg, connecting with her face. She released me just enough for me to scramble upward, clawing my way to the top. I didn't stop running until I burst through the trapdoor and into the night air. The forest was deathly silent. I stumbled away from the cabin, gasping for breath. My mind reeled from what I had just seen. This wasn't about one creature. This was about many. And worse, these weren't mindless monsters. They were something much more terrifying. They were aware, and they had been waiting for someone like me to find them. Story 7. The Awakening. The night stretched endlessly before me, the forest swallowing the last remnants of moonlight. My breath came in shallow gasps as I staggered away from the cabin, my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed. The creatures, the forgotten ones, were real, and worse, they had been waiting. The weight of the rusted badge in my pocket felt heavier than it should. Nathaniel Grant. The name echoed in my mind, a ghostly reminder that this mystery wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about history. A history that had been buried deep beneath the forest floor, waiting to be unearthed. But I had woken something, and now it was awake. A distant sound made me freeze. Not the guttural growls of the creatures from below, not the whispers that had chased me through the tunnels. No, this was something else entirely. It was a howl, low, resonant, ancient, and it was answered. A second howl rose from deeper in the woods, followed by another, then another. My blood ran cold. Whatever lived beneath the earth wasn't the only thing lurking in these woods. There was something bigger, something older. I needed to move. I forced my aching legs into motion, my flashlight barely illuminating the narrow path ahead. I needed higher ground, somewhere I could see what was coming. My radio was still useless. Nothing but static whispering through the speaker. The ranger station was miles away, and I wasn't sure I would make it there alive. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of something rotten. My stomach twisted as the putrid stench coated the back of my throat. It was the same scent that had filled the underground chamber, clinging to the bones stacked against the walls. Then just ahead, I saw movement. A figure. I skidded to a stop, raising my gun. "Stay where you are." The figure hesitated, then stepped forward into the dim glow of my flashlight. It wasn't a creature. It was a man. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and wild. His clothes were torn, caked with mud and dried blood. He looked like he had been running for a very long time. "Please." His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Don't let them take me back." My grip on the gun tightened. "Who are you?" He shook his head frantically. "They hear us. They know." Before I could react, the forest erupted with movement. The trees trembled. Shadows shifted. Something huge moved between the trunks, its form barely visible in the darkness. The man screamed. I turned just in time to see a shape, massive, hulking, lunge from the trees and drag him into the darkness. His screams were swallowed by the night. And then, silence. My pulse thundered in my ears. My body refused to move. The only thing left of the man was the echo of his final cry, fading into the wind. Then, slowly, the glowing eyes began to appear. Not just two, not just four, dozens. They watched me from the trees, from the shadows, from everywhere. The howls began again. This time closer, more urgent, more hungry. I realized then I hadn't just woken something. I had unleashed it. Story 8. The Descent. The silence was suffocating. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears. The trees around me pulsed with an unnatural stillness, the glowing eyes unmoving, watching. I had seen monsters before, but this was different. They weren't attacking. Not yet. They were waiting. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the earth. My body tensed as I slowly backed away. My gun gripped tightly in my trembling hands. My mind raced for a plan, an escape route, anything to get me out of this alive. Then, the ground beneath me shifted. Before I could react, the earth collapsed. I barely had time to let out a strangled yell before I was falling, my body tumbling into darkness. My flashlight spun wildly in the air, its beam flickering across the twisted branches above as I plunged downward. Then, impact. Pain exploded through my body as I hit the cold, damp floor below. The air was knocked from my lungs, my vision swimming. I groaned, rolling onto my side, my fingers digging into the rough ground beneath me. Dirt, stone, and something else. Something wet. I forced myself to sit up, wincing as pain shot through my ribs. My flashlight had landed a few feet away, its beam casting long shadows against the cavern walls. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against something soft. I jerked my hand back, bile rising in my throat. It was flesh. A mangled corpse lay sprawled beside me, its body twisted unnaturally. Torn clothes clung to its frame, the fabric stained dark with old blood. But it wasn't just the sight of the body that made my skin crawl. It was the face, or rather, the lack of one. The flesh had been stripped away, leaving behind nothing but gleaming bone. Whatever had done this hadn't just killed, it had fed. A shiver ran down my spine as I forced myself to look away. I needed to move. I needed to get out. I grabbed my flashlight and rose to my feet, my body protesting with every motion. The cavern stretched endlessly before me, tunnels branching off into the abyss like veins in rotting flesh. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of earth long undisturbed. And then, a sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable, whispering. It echoed through the tunnels, carried by an unseen wind. Words I couldn't understand, voices that sent ice lancing through my veins. I turned, slowly, my flashlight trembling in my grip as I swept the beam across the cavern walls. The whispering grew louder, and then I saw them. Carvings, dozens, etched into the stone. Symbols, figures, depictions of things that shouldn't exist. Twisted creatures with elongated limbs, hollow eyes and gaping mouths. They surrounded a central image, a pit, and beneath it, bodies, hundreds of them. I swallowed hard, a cold realization settling over me. This wasn't just a cave, it was a mass grave. A slow, scraping sound made my blood run cold. I turned sharply, my flashlight landing on a narrow tunnel just beyond the carvings. The entrance was jagged, clawed out of the rock by something that wasn't human, and something was moving inside. A shadow shifted, slithering along the walls. My heartbeat thundered in my chest as I took a step back. The whispering was deafening now. A chorus of voices speaking in tongues older than time itself. Then, the darkness stepped forward. I barely had time to react before it was on me, lunging from the tunnel with an inhuman shriek. I stumbled back, barely dodging the swipe of razor-sharp claws. My flashlight flickered wildly as I scrambled for my gun, my fingers slipping against the sweat coating my skin. I fired. The gunshot echoed through the cavern, deafening, but the creature didn't stop. It jerked, its body convulsing as the bullet struck its shoulder. But instead of going down, it let out a horrific, wet laugh. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't be here." My blood turned to ice. Its voice was wrong, twisted, layered, as if many voices were speaking at once. I fired again. This time, it moved. Fast. Too fast. Before I could react, it was behind me. Pain ripped through my shoulder as claws sank into my flesh, tearing me backward. I screamed, twisting desperately, slamming my elbow into whatever thing had grabbed me. It loosened its grip just enough for me to break free. Stumbling forward, I turned, gun raised, but the creature was gone. The whispering stopped. The cavern fell silent. I stood there, chest heaving, body shaking. The wound on my shoulder throbbed, warm blood seeping through my torn uniform. I didn't have time to think, to process. I needed to get out, gritting my teeth. I turned and sprinted toward the nearest tunnel, my flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. The walls seemed to breathe, shifting as if the stone itself was alive. The pit, the bodies, the whispers. I had stumbled into something far worse than I could ever imagine. And I wasn't alone. Story 9. Beneath the veil, the tunnel stretched endlessly before me, a yawning void carved into the earth. My breathing was ragged, my heartbeat a frantic drum against my ribs. Every step I took sent echoes through the cavern, each one bouncing back like a whisper from something unseen. I wasn't alone down here. The wound on my shoulder throbbed, hot and wet, but I forced myself to move. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that replaced them was worse. Thick, expectant, like the darkness itself was holding its breath. I gripped my gun tighter, my flashlight trembling in my other hand. I had no idea where the tunnel led, only that it went deeper, too deep. The walls felt unnatural, their surfaces too smooth, too intentional, as if something had built this place. That's when I saw it. A door, old, wooden, reinforced with iron. It stood impossibly in the heart of the cave, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, worn with age but still pulsating with something wrong. A warning or an invitation. I swallowed hard, reaching out. The handle was ice cold beneath my fingers. I hesitated for only a moment before twisting it. The door creaked open. The chamber beyond was massive. Rows of stone pillars stretched toward the ceiling, their surfaces covered in familiar carvings. The same twisted figures I had seen in the underground altar. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, blood. I stepped forward, my boots scuffing against the uneven stone. Then I saw them. Bodies. Dozens, no, hundreds, lined the walls, sealed into the rock. Their faces were frozen in expressions of agony, their mouths open in silent screams. The stone had swallowed them, their twisted forms forever trapped in its cold embrace. My stomach lurched. I wasn't in a cavern. I was in a tomb. Then, the whispering returned. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from above. I tilted my flashlight upward, and my mind broke. Suspended from the ceiling, hanging like marionettes, were figures. Not corpses. Not quite alive. Their bodies dangled limply, their limbs elongated and unnatural. Some were missing their faces entirely. Others had eyes that burned like dying embers. They swayed gently, as if stirred by an unseen wind. Then one moved. Its head twisted toward me with a sickening crack. Its mouth opened, but the sound that came out wasn't human. It was laughter. The other figures twitched. One by one, their heads turned, their empty eyes locking onto me. A cold terror gripped me. Then, all at once, they dropped. The air rushed as they plummeted toward the ground, their bodies twisting unnaturally as they fell. I ran, my boots pounding against the stone as I sprinted for the tunnel. The laughter turned to shrieks, high, piercing, echoing through the chamber. I barely made it through the door before something slammed into it behind me. The force sent me sprawling, my flashlight skidding across the floor. I scrambled to my feet, throwing my weight against the door just as clawed fingers reached through the gap. I shoved it closed. The screams on the other side were deafening. Then, silence. I collapsed against the wood, my chest heaving. My mind was still reeling from what I had seen, what I had almost become a part of. This wasn't just a tomb. It was a prison, and something wanted out. Story 10. The Offering. I sat against the door, my chest heaving, my mind racing. The silence beyond the wood felt wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath. My fingers twitched over my gun, my knuckles white from how tightly I was gripping it. I had seen things in the darkness, things that should not have been alive, things that should not have laughed, and yet I was still here, still breathing. For now, a sound broke the silence. A soft tap against the other side of the door. Not a bang. Not a clawed hand trying to break through. Just a tap. Slow, rhythmic, like a knock. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to move. I needed to get out of here. My flashlight was still on the floor, the beam flickering. I snatched it up, my pulse pounding in my ears as I scanned my surroundings. The cavernous hall stretched ahead, its stone walls damp with something thick. My boots left faint impressions in the dust as I moved. Symbols marked the ground, drawn in patterns I couldn't begin to understand. They looked ancient, not just old, but forgotten. Then, up ahead, I saw it. A stone altar. Massive, looming, carved from something darker than the rock around it. Chains dangled from its sides, rusted with age. The ground beneath it was stained, long dried, but unmistakable. Blood. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself forward. There was something resting on the altar. A book. I hesitated before reaching out, my fingers brushing against its brittle cover. The pages crumbled slightly at my touch, but the writing inside remained clear. It wasn't in English, but somehow I understood. The offering must be made. The cycle must continue. Blood for the veil, life for the keeper. My hands tightened around the book as realization sank in. This wasn't just a prison. This was a sacrificial site, I turned sharply, my flashlight sweeping across the chamber. My breath caught in my throat. The walls were lined with figures. They stood motionless, their bodies gaunt, their skin stretched thin over their bones. Their faces were hollow, their eyes sunken. Some had shackles still hanging from their wrists, as if they had once been chained here. And yet, they stared at me. Their lips began to move, but no sound came out. Then, a single whisper from all of them at once. "Run!" I didn't hesitate. I turned and sprinted, my feet pounding against the stone as the whispering swelled into a cacophony of voices. The air grew thick, heavy, alive. Shadows twisted at the edges of my vision, moving against the light. Then I heard it. A deep, guttural breath. Not from behind me, not from the walls, from the altar. I dared a glance back, and it was rising. The chain snapped, the stone cracked, and from beneath the altar, something ancient pulled itself free. A towering figure, its body wrapped in tattered, ceremonial robes. Its face was faceless, a shifting void that swallowed the light. Its hands were skeletal, its fingers too long, reaching outward as if to grasp something unseen. It saw me, and it smiled. A voice slithered into my mind, without sound, without mercy. The offering must be made. The ground trembled. I ran. I didn't look back, but I knew. It was following me. Story 11. The Unseen. The cavern trembled with an unnatural force, a pulse that echoed through the very bones of the earth. I sprinted through the tunnels, the sound of my own ragged breathing drowned out by the guttural voice still slithering through my mind. The offering must be made. I gritted my teeth, pushing forward. The light from my flashlight flickered wildly, barely keeping the suffocating darkness at bay. The thing that had risen from the altar, the keeper, was still following me. I couldn't hear its footsteps, couldn't see its form, but I could feel it. The air behind me was heavy, thick with something unseen, yet undeniable. I had to get out. A sharp turn in the tunnel nearly sent me sprawling. My boots skidded over loose stone as I stumbled forward, the walls narrowing around me. The passage was shifting, twisting, as if the cavern itself was alive, reshaping itself to trap me within. Then, ahead, a faint glow. Hope flared in my chest. An exit. I forced my aching legs to move faster, each step a battle against the weight pressing down on me. The glow grew brighter, flickering like firelight, until I finally burst through the tunnel into a vast, open chamber. And then I stopped. The sight before me stole the breath from my lungs. The chamber stretched impossibly high, the ceiling lost in darkness. Strange monolithic statues loomed in a perfect circle, their carved faces twisted in expressions of agony and reverence. A ring of fire burned at the center, casting eerie, dancing shadows across the cavern walls. And standing within the flames were them, the lost ones, figures draped in tattered robes, their bodies swaying in a rhythmic, unnatural motion. Their faces were obscured beneath hoods, but their eyes, their burning, hollow eyes, pierced through the gloom, locked onto me with something that wasn't quite hunger, but something far worse, recognition. One of them stepped forward, its voice a fractured whisper, layered with many voices at once. You were not meant to see. My blood ran cold. The others turned in unison, their heads snapping toward me with a sickening crack. Then, the chanting began, low at first, almost like a hum vibrating through the stone. Then it grew, each voice joining the next, layering into something that wasn't quite a language, but a sound that seeped into my skin, into my mind. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The chant wasn't being heard. It was being felt. I staggered back, my vision swimming. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm, the statues shifting, warping, their carved faces grinning. I had to move. I turned to run and nearly collided with something. Not a statue, not a figure, something else, something unseen. The air itself thickened, solidified, wrapping around me like invisible tendrils. My arms locked in place, my legs refusing to obey. It was holding me, binding me. A whisper brushed against my ear, though no lips spoke the words. You do not belong here. I thrashed, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My gun, it was still in my hand. I willed my fingers to move, my grip tightening around the handle. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pulled the trigger. The gunshot shattered the air. The invisible force released me. I hit the ground hard, rolling as the chanting stopped. Abrupt, unnatural. My ears rang from the echo of the gunshot, but through the haze, I saw the figures standing motionless, their heads tilted, their hollow eyes wide with something I hadn't seen before. Fear. Then, the air rippled. The fire in the center flared, a shockwave of heat blasting outward. The statues cracked, their stone faces splitting apart as the cavern shook. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. The tunnel ahead yawned open, its darkness seeming almost welcoming compared to the horror behind me. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. The voices screamed behind me, a mixture of rage and something worse. Desperation. The walls collapsed, and then I was falling, tumbling into a new darkness, deeper than the last. The unseen had let me go, but only because something else had caught me. Story 12. The Vanishing at Smoky Creek. Location, Smoky Creek, Tennessee. Date, October 14th, 2022. Time, 7:45 p.m. Deputy Mark Reynolds pulled his patrol truck onto the gravel road leading into Smoky Creek Campground. The sun had just dipped below the tree line, casting the dense Tennessee forest in a deep orange glow. His radio crackled with static before the dispatcher's voice came through. Deputy Reynolds, any update on the missing camper? Negative, Mark replied, glancing at his notes. Last sighting was around 6 p.m., reported by his wife. Name's David Miller, 42 years old, visiting from Nashville, went to gather firewood, never came back. Copy that. Keep us updated. Mark parked near campsite number 17, where a woman stood by the fire pit, arms wrapped around herself despite the mild evening air. Her eyes were red from crying. Mrs. Miller, Mark greeted her gently. She turned, clutching her phone. Yes, please, have you found him? Not yet, ma'am. Can you walk me through what happened? She nodded, wiping at her face. We got here yesterday afternoon. David wanted a quiet weekend. Just us and nature. He left to find firewood around 6, and he didn't come back. I called his phone, but it's going straight back to voicemail." Mark glanced at the surrounding forest. The trees were thick, the underbrush dense, easy to get turned around if you weren't familiar with the area. But something in Mrs. Miller's expression unsettled him. "You said he went alone?" Mark asked. "Yes, but he wasn't worried. He grew up hiking these kinds of places." She hesitated, looking toward the darkening woods. "I heard something about half an hour after he left. At first I thought it was him coming back, but it sounded wrong." Mark's brow furrowed. "Wrong how?" She swallowed. "Like footsteps, but heavy. Too heavy for David. And then there was this sound like breathing, but deep and slow, almost like growling." A shiver ran down Mark's spine. He'd worked in law enforcement for 10 years, and he knew that kind of fear in someone's voice wasn't imagined. "I'll start searching now," he assured her. "Stay here, keep your phone on, and if anything happens, anything at all, call 911. Mrs. Miller nodded quickly. Mark grabbed his flashlight and radio, stepping past the campfire and into the tree line. The moment he left the clearing, the air grew different, thicker, still. Even the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves had faded into an eerie quiet. "David?" Mark called, his voice swallowed by the dark. He moved deeper into the forest, sweeping his flashlight across the trees. Then he saw it, a pile of firewood stacked neatly at the base of a tree. "David?" Mark called again, stepping closer. The logs looked freshly cut, the bark still damp, but something was off. The ground nearby was disturbed, as if someone had been dragged. His hand went to his holster. He crouched, examining the dirt, his flashlight catching something white among the leaves. A cell phone. Mark picked it up. The screen cracked, but still lit. A missed call notification glowed on the screen. Samantha Miller, 702 PIM. David's last attempt to reach his wife. Then, from the trees ahead, a snap. Mark's breath caught. He rose slowly, his flashlight scanning the darkness. The beam landed on something tall between the trees. At first, he thought it was a branch, until it moved. Eyes. 2 gleaming yellow eyes staring at him from a height that wasn't natural. Mark's hand tightened on his gun. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, a step. A heavy, deliberate step toward him. Mark's instincts screamed at him to run, but his training held him in place. He raised his gun. "I said stop!" The thing stepped forward into the flashlight's glow, and Mark's world tilted. It was tall, at least 7 feet, its body covered in matted fur, its limbs too long, its fingers ending in claws. But it was its face that made his blood run cold, because it wasn't just an animal. It was David Miller. His features were still there, twisted, distorted, his mouth too wide, his teeth too sharp. His clothes hung in tattered remnants from his frame. But his eyes, those weren't human anymore. They glowed with something ancient, something hungry. "David," Mark whispered. The thing smiled, then it charged. Story 13. The Shadow over Black Hollow. Black Hollow, West Virginia, late October 2023. The first call came in just before midnight. Sheriff Daniel Whitmore was nursing a cup of coffee at his desk when the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. "Sheriff, we've got a report of a missing hiker near Black Hollow. Family says he went out before sunset And hasn't come back. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. Black Hollow wasn't the kind of place you wanted to be lost in after dark. Name? He asked, already pulling on his jacket. Lucas Carter, 20 years old. Local guy, knows the area. Daniel frowned. If Lucas knew the woods, why hadn't he made it back? All right, I'm heading out. The drive up to Black Hollow was quiet, the kind of silence that pressed in from all sides. The headlights carved a path through the thick trees, shadows stretching unnaturally across the road. When he arrived at the trailhead, Lucas's truck was still there. The hood was cold. He'd been out here for hours. Daniel grabbed his flashlight and radio. The forest was dense, even more so at night, and the air carried a sharp bite. Lucas, he called, his voice swallowed by the trees. Nothing. He moved deeper into the woods, his boots crunching over fallen leaves. The trail was familiar. He had walked it countless times, but tonight it felt different, wrong. Then he saw the footprints. 2 sets. One belonged to Lucas. The other was bigger, and it followed him all the way into the trees. Daniel's gut tightened. He pressed the radio to his mouth. Dispatch, I found tracks. Something was following him. A burst of static. Then, a click. Not static. Not feedback. A clicking sound, like something tapping against the speaker. Daniel's blood ran cold. Dispatch? Silence. Then, a whisper. Low, guttural, right behind him. He turned sharply, flashlight beam sweeping the darkness. The trees stood still. The air was heavy. Then something moved. A shadow, low to the ground, crawling, watching. The flashlight flickered. The clicking started again. And from the darkness, a voice, Lucas's voice, called out, Sheriff? Daniel's stomach twisted. The voice was wrong. It was too close. And Lucas's footprints only went one way. He never came back. Daniel took a slow step back, his hand instinctively moving to his holster. His breath felt heavy, his lungs tightening against the thickening air. Lucas, he called again, his voice barely above a whisper. Nothing. Then a rustling sound, subtle, like something shifting through the leaves. His flashlight landed on the base of a tree. Something was there. A figure, low to the ground, barely visible in the underbrush. The figure moved. Daniel's muscles tensed as he took another step back. The thing in the bushes let out a slow, deliberate breath. Then it stood up, not like a man, not like something natural. It unfolded, limbs stretching in ways that didn't make sense, its joints cracking like dry wood. Daniel's gun was in his hand before he even realized he had drawn it. Stay where you are, he ordered. The thing didn't listen. It took a step forward, its form shifting between shadow and flesh. Its face, Lucas's face, was there and then gone, melting into something stretched and hollow. The clicking started again, louder, closer. Then, without warning, it lunged. Daniel fired. The gunshot cracked through the forest, momentarily lighting up the trees. The thing jerked, a sharp cry escaping its throat. But it didn't fall. It laughed. Daniel turned and ran. Branches clawed at his arms as he sprinted back toward the trail. The sound of footsteps, no, crawling, chased him through the dark. He didn't dare look back. Then, Ahead, his truck. He yanked the door open, barely throwing himself inside before slamming it shut. His hands fumbled for the keys, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Outside, the clicking stopped. Silence. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He turned the key. The engine roared to life. His headlights flared against the trees, and in their glow, the thing stood just at the edge of the forest, watching, waiting. A wide, too wide smile spread across its shifting face. Then, it took a step backward and melted into the trees. Story 14. The Abandoned House on Briar Road, Charleston, South Carolina, November 2023. Detective Ryan Caldwell never believed in ghosts. He had spent 15 years with the Charleston Police Department, solving homicides, drug cases, and missing persons reports. The cases that haunted him weren't supernatural, just the cruelty of humans. But when the call came in about a missing family on Briar Road, something felt different. The Hendersons, father, mother, and their 10-year-old son, had moved into the old house a week ago. Last night, the father called 911, frantic, saying something was in the house. The call cut off before officers could get details. When patrol arrived, the front door was open and the family was gone. Ryan pulled onto Briar Road just before sunset. The house loomed at the end of the cul-de-sac, an old Victorian with peeling paint and warped shutters. The neighbors wouldn't go near it. Some muttered about its history, about the disappearances decades ago. He didn't care about ghost stories. He cared about facts. Stepping inside, the first thing he noticed was the silence. No hum of appliances, no creaking floors, just stillness. Then, the smell hit him. Damp wood, mold, and something metallic. Blood. A streak led from the hallway to the basement door. Ryan unholstered his weapon and flicked on his flashlight. Charleston PD. If anyone's here, show yourself. Silence. Then, a thump from below. Ryan's grip tightened. He had been in dozens of dangerous situations, but this was wrong. His instincts screamed at him to turn back. He ignored them and descended the basement stairs. The air was thick, humid. His flashlight swept over the concrete walls, revealing scratch marks along the surface, deep ones. Then he saw them. 3 chairs sat in a circle in the middle of the basement. Each one had ropes tied to the arms and legs. Each one was empty. Ryan's pulse quickened. He turned, scanning the walls. The blood trail ended near a set of old wooden shelves. Something was off about them. He pressed against the side. A click. The shelves moved, revealing a hidden door. Ryan exhaled sharply, stepping through. The room beyond was wrong. A stone floor, not concrete. Walls covered in symbols. A stench that made his stomach turn. Then, in the center of the room, he saw it. A mirror. Tall, ornate, covered in dust. But the reflection was wrong, because in the mirror, the chairs weren't empty. The Hendersons were still sitting in them, mouths open, eyes wide with terror. Ryan's breath caught. He turned sharply, but the room was empty. The reflection was the only place they still existed. Then, the boy in the mirror turned to look at him. Ryan stumbled back, his flashlight shaking. His own reflection stayed frozen. but the boy's head tilted. A whisper filled the room. "Help us." The boy's lips never moved, but his reflections did. Ryan's instincts screamed run, but his feet refused to move. His gaze locked on the mirror as the image began to shift. The boy stood up. His parents didn't. Behind him, the shadows rippled. A shape emerged, tall, twisted, its face shrouded in darkness. Its hand lowered onto the boy's shoulder. Ryan's own breath hitched as the boy's expression contorted into something between a sob and a silent scream. Then the whisper changed. "He's watching." Ryan took a step back, and the thing in the mirror turned its head toward him. He fired his gun. The glass shattered. The scream that followed wasn't human, and the basement plunged into darkness. Story 15. The Man in the Cornfield, Kansas, October 2023. The first call came from a trucker passing through. "There's someone standing in the cornfield," he told 911. "Not moving, just watching." Deputy Jake Harris was the one who responded. He figured it was just a scarecrow or some drunk wandering off the road. Happens all the time in the middle of nowhere. But when he arrived, there was no one there. Just an old abandoned farmhouse, and the feeling that something wasn't right. Jake parked his cruiser on the shoulder, stepping out into the chilly autumn air. The cornfield stretched for miles on either side, the dried stalks swaying gently in the wind. He clicked on his flashlight, scanning the area. "Sheriff's Department," he called. "Anyone out here?" Silence. He sighed. Probably just some prank. Still, he walked toward the field, boots crunching over gravel. The scent of damp earth filled the air. The trucker had said the figure was near the old farmhouse, about 100 yards ahead. As Jake approached, the house loomed into view. It was a relic from another time, its wooden frame warped with age. The windows were shattered, the front door barely hanging on its hinges. Something about it made his skin crawl. He stepped up onto the porch, the boards groaning beneath his weight. "Anyone in there?" No response. He pushed the door open, the rusty hinges shrieking. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. It smelled of rot and dust. Then he saw the footprints, fresh, leading deeper into the house. Jake followed, his heartbeat steady but alert. The prints led into the kitchen, where an old wooden table sat in the center of the room. On it, a single candle, still burning. That's when he heard it. A rustling sound, coming from outside. He turned sharply, moving back to the front door. Stepping onto the porch, his flashlight swept across the cornfield. And there, standing between the rows, was a man. Not moving, not blinking, just standing there. Jake's grip on his flashlight tightened. "Sir, you all right?" No response. The figure was tall, dressed in tattered clothes, his head slightly tilted. Jake stepped off the porch. "I need you to..." Then the man moved. Not toward him, not away. He sank, straight down into the corn, as if the earth itself swallowed him whole. Jake's blood ran cold. He sprinted forward, parting the stalks where the figure had been standing. But there was nothing. No footprints, no disturbed dirt, just the endless field of corn. Then, a whisper, right behind him. Jake spun, his flashlight beam catching movement at the edge of the field. A shadow slipping into the farmhouse. His radio crackled. "Deputy Harris, we just got another call. Same location. Caller says there's someone standing in the cornfield." Jake swallowed hard, his eyes darting back to the rows of corn, now too quiet. "I think," he murmured, stepping back toward his cruiser. "We have a problem." Story 16. The Cabin at Devil's Ridge, Appalachian Mountains, North Carolina, November 2023. Officer Daniel Mercer had seen his fair share of strange cases, but this one unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. 2 campers had gone missing near Devil's Ridge, a remote stretch of forest deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Their last known location was an old hunting cabin, long abandoned, sitting on a ridge overlooking miles of untouched wilderness. The thing that sent a chill down Daniel's spine? The last message one of them had sent before disappearing. "There's someone outside, but he's not moving." Daniel arrived at the trailhead just before dusk. The air was crisp, the scent of damp earth and pine filling his lungs as he stepped out of his truck. The other officers had already searched the lower trails with no sign of the campers. That left the cabin, a place the locals whispered about, a place where people went missing. Daniel grabbed his flashlight and radio, starting up the overgrown path. The climb was steep, the forest unnervingly quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of his own boots crunching through the leaves. As he neared the ridge, the cabin came into view, and his stomach dropped. The door was wide open. The inside of the cabin was cold. Dust floated in the air, disturbed only by the faint breeze slipping through the broken window. The wooden floor creaked under Daniel's weight as he stepped inside. A half-burned candle sat on the table. Backpacks lay discarded near the fireplace, but no sign of the campers. Then he saw the notebook. It was open on the table, pages filled with frantic writing. Daniel's pulse quickened as he read. "Oh." November 3rd, 2023, 11:40 p.m. "We heard something outside. We thought it was an animal at first, but then we saw him, standing at the edge of the trees, not moving, just staring at the cabin. We called out. No response. We locked the door, but when we looked again, he was closer." Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the edges of the notebook. He turned the page. November 4th, 2023, 12:30 a.m. The knocking started 20 minutes ago. Slow, rhythmic. We tried calling for help. No signal. The knocking stopped. We thought maybe he left. But then we heard it. The breathing. Inside the cabin. Daniel's breath hitched. The last entry was written hastily, the letters uneven. He's inside. A sudden thud made Daniel snap his head up. From the back room, his hand went to his holster as he stepped forward, the floor groaning beneath him. He reached the doorway, pushing it open with the barrel of his gun. The room was empty, but the window was open, and the dust on the floor had been disturbed. Something had been in here. Then, a whisper, right behind him. Daniel spun, gun raised, but he was alone. The air felt heavy, charged with something unseen. He swallowed, forcing himself to move back toward the main room. That's when he saw it. The candle, the one on the table, it had been burned down further, Someone had been here while he was in the other room. Someone was still here. The air shifted. A floorboard creaked. Daniel turned and the door slammed shut. Darkness swallowed the cabin. Story 7. The Beast of Blood Mountain, Chattahoochee National Forest, Georgia, December 2023. Park Ranger Evan Mitchell had been working these mountains for years, but nothing prepared him for the call that came in just after dusk. A hiker, frantic and out of breath, had stumbled into the visitor center, claiming that his friend had been dragged into the woods by something huge. He kept repeating the same thing over and over. It wasn't a bear. Evan radioed for backup, but knew that, up here, response time was slow. If someone was in danger, he was the only help they had. Grabbing his rifle and flashlight, he set off into the forest, following the trail the hiker had described. The further he went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, distant owls, had vanished. He found the first sign of struggle about a mile in. A torn backpack, its contents scattered, a deep groove in the dirt as if something heavy had been dragged. Then he saw the blood. It was smeared across the bark of a tree, leading deeper into the woods. His flashlight flickered, and for the first time that night, a moan shiver ran down his spine. Evan moved carefully, stepping over broken branches and keeping his rifle at the ready. Then he heard it, a deep guttural growl that seemed to shake the air itself. He turned sharply, scanning the darkness. His light caught movement just beyond the trees. A shape, tall, hunched, covered in dark, matted fur. It stood on two legs, but its posture was all wrong. Its arms too long, its claws curled against the earth. It took a step forward, and Evan could finally see its face. Yellow eyes, a snout lined with jagged teeth, and the unmistakable stench of death. His breath hitched. Dogman. The creature snarled, lowering itself as if preparing to lunge. Evan took a slow step back, his grip tightening on his rifle. He knew a single shot wouldn't stop something like this. His only option was to retreat. Get back to the station, get back up, get the hell out of these woods. But then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, another growl echoed. Then another, and another. Evan's stomach dropped. There wasn't just one of them. The dogman in front of him let out a sound somewhere between a bark and a laugh, as if it knew he had nowhere to go. Evan turned and ran. His boots pounded against the dirt, breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear them behind him, their heavy footfalls shaking the ground. The station was still a half-mile away. Too far. He needed to hide. Spotting an outcropping of rocks, he dove behind them, pressing himself flat against the stone. He held his breath, gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. Silence. Then, the slow, deliberate sound of sniffing. They were searching for him. One of them let out a low growl, and the air grew thick with tension. Evan could feel his heartbeat in his throat. He had one shot. If they found him, he was dead. Then, distantly, a sound. A howl, but not like theirs. Higher, more drawn out. Whatever it was, it distracted them. The dogmen hesitated, their heads snapping toward the source of the noise. Then, in unison, they turned and disappeared into the trees. Evan didn't move, barely dared to breathe. He waited until he was sure they were gone, then forced himself to his feet and stumbled back toward the station. He didn't stop running until he was inside, locking the door behind him. When he radioed it in, his supervisor didn't believe him, but Evan knew what he saw, and he knew that somewhere out there, on Blood Mountain, the beasts were still watching, waiting. Story 18. The Wendigo at Frost Hollow. Frost Hollow, Montana, January 2024. The call came in just past midnight. A hunter had gone missing near Frost Hollow, a remote stretch of wilderness known for its brutal winters and strange stories. His brother, panicked and nearly frostbitten, had stumbled into the ranger station, mumbling about something watching them from the trees. Ranger Michael Carter grabbed his gear and set out immediately. A blizzard was rolling in, and if the hunter was still out there, he wouldn't last the night. The trail was barely visible under the thickening snow, but Michael followed the tracks leading away from the hunter's abandoned camp. Footsteps, deep and uneven, suggested someone had been running. Then something else appeared beside them. Long, clawed prints, twice the size of his own boots. His gut twisted. The locals had whispered about things in these woods. Creatures that moved with the storm, appearing only when the wind howled through the trees. Wendigo. Michael had never believed in those stories, until now. A low, eerie howl echoed through the trees. Not a wolf, not anything natural. He tightened his grip on his rifle and pressed forward. The tracks led to a small ravine where the snow had been disturbed. Something had struggled here. Then he saw it. A boot, half buried in the snow. His radio crackled. "Michael, you need to get out of there." It was his partner back at the station, voice tight with urgency. Michael frowned. "What? Why?" "There's something on the motion cameras. It's behind you." His blood ran cold. Slowly he turned, his flashlight sweeping across the trees. At first, he saw nothing, just swirling snow and endless darkness. Then, the eyes, pale, glowing, too high off the ground. Michael's breath hitched. The shape was tall, impossibly thin. Its limbs stretched unnaturally. Its mouth, if that was a mouth, hung open, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. The wind howled, and the creature took a slow, deliberate step forward. Michael ran. The trees blurred past as he sprinted, heart hammering in his chest. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. But he could hear it. Footsteps, impossibly fast, closing the distance with every second. His truck was just ahead. If he could make it. A sharp pain tore through his back. He hit the ground hard. The air knocked from his lungs. Snow filled his mouth as he gasped for breath. He twisted, raising his rifle, but the creature was gone. Silence. Only the wind and the distant crackle of his radio. Michael staggered to his feet, pain lancing through his body. His jacket was shredded, 3 deep gashes running across his shoulder blade. But he was alive, stumbling, half frozen. He made it to his truck and threw himself inside, locking the doors. His hands shook as he started the engine. The headlights flickered on. And there, standing at the edge of the trees, the Wendigo watched. It didn't move, didn't chase. It just waited, as if it knew Michael would have to come back. Story 19. The Silent Ones of Redwood Gorge. Redwood National Park, California, March 2024. Ranger Thomas Hayes had worked these forests for over a decade. But nothing prepared him for what he found at Site 14. A group of campers, 3 adults and 1 teenager, had vanished overnight. Their tents were still there, their gear untouched. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. But there was one thing left behind: a wooden mask, crudely carved, placed in the center of their extinguished fire pit. Thomas had seen plenty of strange things in the backcountry, but this unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. He radioed the station, reporting the disappearance, and then decided to investigate further before nightfall. The deeper he went into the forest, the heavier the air became. It was more than just silence. It was absence. The usual hum of insects, the rabble, the rustling of squirrels in the underbrush, even the distant calls of birds. Gone. Then he heard it. A whisper, faint, almost melodic, like a song carried on the wind. He turned sharply, scanning the trees. Nothing. But when he looked back at the path, the mask was there, lying in the dirt, just a few feet in front of him. Thomas's pulse quickened. He hadn't brought it. He hadn't touched it. Something wanted him to see it. He bent down, hesitating before picking it up. The wood was old, smooth, as if worn by countless hands. The face carved into it was expressionless, featureless, except for 2 deep eye sockets, hollow and dark. A sudden gust of wind blew through the trees, and with it, laughter, soft at first, then rising, not just one voice, many. Thomas dropped the mask and reached for his radio. "Base, this is Hayes. I need immediate." Static. Then, beneath the white noise, a voice. "Leave." The laughter stopped. A branch snapped behind him. Thomas turned, his flashlight beam catching something between the trees. A figure, standing impossibly still. Tall, draped in something dark. A hood? No, not a hood. Another mask. Then another figure stepped from the shadows. And another. Within seconds, dozens of them stood in the clearing, surrounding him, all wearing those hollow-eyed masks. Thomas's breath came fast and shallow. He stepped back, his hand hovering over his sidearm. None of them moved. Then, in eerie unison, they all tilted their heads, watching, waiting. Thomas did the only thing he could. He ran. The forest blurred around him as he sprinted back toward the campsite. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel them, moving, following. His truck was just ahead. If he could make it, a figure stepped onto the trail, blocking his way. This one was different, taller. Its mask was more elaborate, painted with symbols he didn't recognize. Thomas skidded to a stop, heart pounding. "Who are you?" he demanded, drawing his weapon. The figure raised a hand. The forest went silent. Then, a voice whispered impossibly close to his ear. "You were never supposed to see us." The lights on his truck flickered. The world tilted. And then, everything went black. Story 20. The Drowned Ones of Blackwater Bay. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay. Officer James Holloway stood on the pier, staring out at the still waters of Blackwater Bay. The call had come in just before midnight. A fisherman had seen something floating near the old dock. Something wrong. Now, as James shone his flashlight over the surface, the beam caught the unmistakable shape of a hand, pale and bloated, reaching just above the waterline. He radioed for backup before stepping closer. The wood creaked beneath his boots as he knelt, trying to get a better look. The body was tangled in seaweed, its face turned away. James exhaled, steadying himself before grabbing the wrist. The hand was warm. James froze. Drowned bodies were never warm. Then, before he could react, the fingers twitched. A surge of panic shot through him as the body jerked, its head snapping up. The face, gray, waterlogged, eyes hollow and black, locked onto him. A guttural gasp wheezed from its bloated lips. James yanked his hand back, stumbling as the corpse lurched forward, clawing at the dock with unnatural strength. The air was suddenly filled with a sickening, wet, dragging sound. As more bodies began to rise from the water, their silhouettes breaking the surface in eerie unison. 1, 2, 5. Dozens. Their heads lolled unnaturally as they turned toward him, mouths opening in silent, gaping expressions of hunger or despair. The water around them churned, though there was no wind, no movement in the bay itself. Only them, the drowned ones. James bolted. He barely made it to his patrol car before throwing it into reverse, gravel spraying as he tore away from the dock. His hands trembled as he reached for his radio. Dispatch. Jesus Christ, send someone to Blackwater Bay now. There are... A burst of static, then a voice whispering through the speaker. You saw us. James slammed the brakes, his blood running cold. The radio crackled again, the whisper turning into a low, wet, gurgling noise. He looked up and saw them standing in the road. The drowned ones, water dripping from their sagging skin, watching him. James reached for his gun, but the second his fingers touched it, the figures in the road vanished. Only the dark, empty highway remained. His radio remained silent for the rest of the night, and the next morning, when backup arrived at the dock, there were no bodies in the water, but the wooden planks where he had stood were still wet. Story 21. The Thing in Ravenwood Forest, Ranger. Ben Calloway had seen strange things in his 15 years working Ravenwood Forest, but nothing compared to what happened the night of April 12th. The call came in just after sunset. A camper had gone missing near the eastern ridge. His friends reported that he had stepped away from the fire to relieve himself and never came back. They searched for an hour before calling for help. When Ben arrived at their campsite, he found the group shaken and uneasy. One of them, a young woman named Lila, kept saying the same thing over and over. It took him. Ben tried to reassure them that wild animals were a more likely culprit than some unseen force, but something in their eyes told him they had seen something unnatural. The search began immediately. Ben followed the missing camper's tracks leading into the woods. At first, everything seemed normal. Boot prints in the dirt, slightly staggered as if he'd been walking quickly. Then, after about 30 yards, the prints stopped. Not faded, not covered, just stopped, as if the man had vanished into thin air. Ben's stomach tightened. He scanned the ground, the trees, looking for anything. Drag marks, broken branches, anything. But there was nothing, just silence, heavy, unnatural silence. Then, from deep in the woods, something clicked. A low, rhythmic clicking sound, almost like the tapping of bones. It echoed through the trees, growing closer, Ben gripped his flashlight, turning in a slow circle. "Hello? If you're out there, call out." The clicking stopped. Then from directly behind him, a whisper, "Leave." Ben spun around, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. But there was nothing there. Then, a branch snapped in the distance, followed by something huge moving through the underbrush. Heavy, deliberate footfalls. Ben's instincts screamed at him to run, but his training held him in place. He raised his radio. "Dispatch, I need backup at Ravenwood East. Something's out here with me." Static. Then, the radio crackled to life, but it wasn't dispatch on the other end. It was breathing. Ragged, wet, close. Ben didn't wait. He turned and ran. The forest blurred around him as the sound of pursuit grew louder. Too fast, too close, too wrong. He reached the campsite in record time, breathless and shaking. The campers looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Did you see it?" Lila whispered. Ben couldn't answer. He could only listen. The clicking had started again, and this time, it was all around them. Story 22. The Watchers in Black Pine Valley. The locals had always warned about Black Pine Valley. It wasn't just the isolation or the way the fog clung to the trees, even in summer. It was the disappearances. Every few years, a hiker, a hunter, or some unlucky traveler would vanish without a trace. The bodies were never found. Ranger Luke Weston knew the stories, but he didn't believe them. Not until the night he found the cabin. A call had come in earlier that evening. A group of campers reported seeing strange lights moving through the trees near their site. Too synchronized to be flashlights, too erratic to be anything natural. They also claimed to hear voices, whispering things they couldn't understand. Luke chalked it up to nerves, or too much whiskey by the fire. But when he arrived, he found the campers huddled together, pale and shaking. One of them, a man in his mid-30s, grabbed Luke's arm. "It's watching us," he whispered. "It's still out there." Luke scanned the tree line with his flashlight. Nothing. He told them to stay put while he checked the perimeter. The further he walked, the quieter the forest became. No insects, no wind, just the sound of his own breathing. Then, ahead in the darkness, something moved. At first, he thought it was an animal, but as he stepped closer, his light caught something impossible. A cabin. It hadn't been on any maps, and it sure as hell hadn't been here before. Not on any of his patrols. The structure was old, the wood dark and rotting, yet the door stood slightly open as if waiting for him. Luke hesitated, gripping his radio. "Base, this is Weston. I found an abandoned structure at the valley's edge. Could be a squatter. Going to check it out." Static. Then, a reply. But it wasn't from dispatch. It was his own voice. "Base, this is Weston. I found an abandoned structure." His stomach clenched. That wasn't an echo. Someone, or something, was repeating him. The trees around him shifted. Shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting toward the cabin. A low hum filled the air, like a distant radio stuck between stations. The door creaked open a little wider. He should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he didn't. He stepped inside. The air was wrong, thick, heavy. The room was empty except for a single chair in the center, and on that chair, a mirror. The glass was warped, old, but Luke could see his reflection clearly, too clearly. He took a step forward, heart hammering in his chest. Then his reflection smiled. Luke did not. The door behind him slammed shut. The hum grew into a deafening roar as the shadows in the glass moved. And just before the world went dark, he saw them, figures, tall and thin, watching from the edges of the mirror. And they were getting closer. Story 23. The Howling in Silverwood. The first report came from a retired couple driving through Silverwood National Forest just after midnight. They claimed to have seen something massive standing in the middle of the road, something covered in thick fur, its eyes glowing in the reflection of their headlights. The creature didn't move. It didn't flinch. It only watched. The couple panicked and reversed down the winding road, their taillights catching one final glimpse of the thing before it vanished into the trees. When they reached the nearest ranger station, the old man whispered 3 words Luke Morgan had heard too many times before. It wasn't human. Luke had worked Silverwood for over a decade, and while he never put much stock in local legends, he knew one thing for certain. People went missing here. Hikers, campers, even rangers. Sometimes they were found miles from where they should have been, confused and dehydrated. Other times, they weren't found at all. And those who returned never spoke about what they saw. That night, Luke decided to check the area himself. He drove up the same road, his truck bouncing along the uneven dirt path. The only sound the crunch of tires and the distant hum of wind through the trees. As he neared the spot the couple described, he slowed to a crawl, shining his spotlight into the forest. Nothing but endless trees. He was about to call it in when he saw them. Footprints. Huge, deep impressions in the mud, leading from the road into the darkness beyond. Whatever had been here, it was big. Too big. Grabbing his rifle and flashlight, Luke stepped out of the truck. The air felt heavier the moment his boots touched the ground. The usual sounds of the forest muted, like the world was holding its breath. He followed the tracks, keeping his rifle close. The deeper he went, the more uneasy he became. The footprints were wrong. Not just large, but distorted, like whatever made them had shifted as it moved. Then, ahead in the trees, he saw it. A figure, tall and hulking, partially hidden by the underbrush. His flashlight barely reached it, but he could see enough. Matted fur, long limbs, and those eyes, reflecting the light like an animal's, but filled with something too intelligent. Luke raised his rifle. "This is park property. You need to identify yourself." No response. Then it moved. Not like an animal, not like a person. It crawled, shifting onto all fours with unnatural speed, its body contorting as it disappeared into the darkness. The trees shook. The air grew thick with the scent of something rotten. Then came the sound. A deep, guttural howl that rattled in Luke's chest. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't anything natural. The radio on his shoulder crackled to life. Static at first, then something else. A voice, low, distorted, impossible. "Luke." His stomach dropped. He didn't answer. He didn't move. The voice came again, this time from the trees ahead. "Luke." Something was mimicking him. Then the howling started again, closer this time, too close. Luke turned and ran. The forest blurred past him, branches whipping against his arms as he sprinted back toward his truck. He didn't stop until he reached it, slamming the door shut and locking it tight. His hands trembled as he grabbed the radio, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Dispatch, this is Morgan. He stopped. The footprints were gone. The trees were still. Only the smell remained. Then, from somewhere just beyond the tree line, laughter. Not human, not even close. Story 24. The lights over Algonquin. The cold hit first. A deep, biting chill that seeped through Ranger Daniel Holt's jacket as he stepped out of his truck, the snow crunching beneath his boots. Algonquin Provincial Park was no stranger to harsh winters. But tonight, something felt different. The call had come in just before dusk. A pair of snowshoers had gone missing near Lake Opiongo. Their last message was garbled, nearly unintelligible, but one phrase came through clear. "The lights are moving." Daniel had heard stories about the lights. Everyone in the park had. Strange, shimmering orbs that appeared deep in the backcountry, flickering in patterns that didn't match anything natural. The older rangers dismissed them as atmospheric reflections or electrical discharges, but those who had seen them up close spoke of something else, something watching. He adjusted his rifle strap and started down the trail, following the snowshoers' tracks. The sky above was a vast expanse of stars, the aurora faint but visible on the horizon. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it a strange stillness, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. He found the first sign of trouble near the frozen creek, an abandoned backpack half buried in the snow. The tracks around it were erratic, as if someone had been running in circles. Daniel bent down, brushing the frost off the pack. A flashlight lay beside it, still on, its beam flickering weakly against the ice. Then the wind shifted, and he caught the faintest sound, a hum, low, vibrating through the trees, just at the edge of hearing. He turned, scanning the darkness with his own flashlight. The tracks continued deeper into the woods, but something was wrong. At first, they were normal, deep impressions where snowshoes had sunk into the powder. Then, a few steps later, the pattern changed. The imprints became lighter, shallower, and then they stopped. Daniel's pulse quickened. There were no signs of a struggle, no alternate path, no broken branches leading away. It was as if the missing hikers had simply vanished into thin air. Then, above him, the sky shifted. The stars flickered, and the lights appeared. Not the aurora, not reflections. These were closer, weaving between the trees, hovering in impossible formations, a deep, pulsing blue, moving with purpose. They weren't random. They were searching. Daniel backed away slowly, his breath visible in the freezing air. The hum grew louder, vibrating in his bones. He reached for his radio. "Base, this is Holt. I need immediate static." Then a voice, not his dispatcher's, not human. "You shouldn't be here." The lights blinked, once, twice, then rushed toward him. The last thing he remembered was the sensation of falling upward,